Hi, Adam.
Oh,
Hi. Good to see you. That's nice.
My reading.
Good thing to sign on to see you reading the book. That's cool.
Well, it would be better if you signed on to see me already having read it, because I moved on to another book. But
oh yeah,
I'm well. Although we're up here where I am in the Hudson Valley, we're expecting a good bit of snow tomorrow, so I have a good excuse to stay in bed late, Joe, and read the rest. Finish my Billy Wilder.
Great. Well, it's a long book, isn't it?
It's long in the good way, though. It's not a criticism to say the book is long. It's a, if you're a fan of Joseph McBride and you're a fan of Billy Wilder,
thank you.
Long is good.
Well, he has such a long career. Even Lubitsch made 72 films, but he died at age 55, and Billy Wilder lived a lot longer and made a lot more films when you include all his screenwriting. So it became a huge book.
So you're just to set the stage. You're in Monument Valley.
Yeah, that's my. Oh, actually, that's funny. I was going to do a real backdrop here, which is just a screen that I put up because I want to block out my messy room here.
No problem.
But the Monument Valley backdrop, I could put up a Billy Wilder backdrop if that would be better.
Doesn't matter. We're also going to discuss Coen Brothers. It could be True Grit, right? Because the Coens shot True Grit at Monument Valley, or did they not?
They didn't. They did part of it. Yeah, actually, there is the opening shot, and a couple shots are in Monument Valley.
Okay.
I just put up a backdrop of me interviewing Billy Wilder in 1974.
Perfect. I love it.
With some Japanese journalists there.
Oh, I see. He's translating for you.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, translating it to Japanese. Let me just move around a little bit. Yeah.
Well, 1, 2, 3 was shot in Tokyo, right? Or at least it takes place in Tokyo.
He was thinking. No, I think what you're thinking.
Berlin.
He was thinking of a remake set in China with Jackie Mason.
Oh, that's bizarre. No, it was in Berlin, right?
Yeah, Berlin. One of his late projects, though, he had the notion to do. He's going to produce, but not direct, a version set in China, which could have been interesting, I suppose.
It would have been. Well, where do we start? Where would you like to begin? Because as we mentioned, you have your new Ernst Lubitsch book. I'm sorry, your new Billy Wilder book. I think it was an excuse. That's why I said it that way, because I think it was just an excuse for you to continue your foray into the career of Ernst Lubitsch.
I have the new book on the Coen Brothers is coming out March 1st. I'm just trying to figure out the lighting here.
It's pretty good.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I can see.
I'm happy with it. Better than mine. Mine is kind of got I can never quite get it. This is as good as it's going to get, I think.
Yeah. You have a kind of overhead light, I think, there.
Yeah.
Well, I have the book on the Coen Brothers that comes out March 1st. When do you plan to air the podcast?
How about what day would be best? We could do this. We could do it. It's the book's in pre-order. The Whole Durn.
Well, anytime the book is coming out, in a few days, so it's fine. People can pre-order the book too, so it really doesn't matter that much,
Right. I mean, I think people we'll put it out. Let's see, the 1st is Tuesday. Why don't I put it out on the 1st?
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be the day of publication.
I'll do it on the video on the 1st, and then I'll do the podcast, I think, as quickly as I can, maybe that Friday. The 3rd or 4th, whatever the 4th or whatever the day that is, March 4th. March 4th. March 4th to the bookstore or your online bookstore and purchase a book. It's called The Whole Durn. Remind me of the title.
The Whole Durn Human Comedy.
Human Comedy.
This is it right here. Did I send you the covers of the various books?
I have the cover of that. You sent me the cover and the digital advance.
Okay.
And which I read, and I did read that. Of course, it's a bit of more digestible or it's digestible size, because it's only 93 pages. which is maybe because it's kind of for those interested, and we have begun, Joe. So I apologize again. It's no. It's sort of like the whole show is a cold opening. It's just you just sort of start. But the Coen Brothers book feels like an essay, and in fact, it is an expanded essay, correct?
Yeah, I originally, excuse me, I started writing that in 2017. I did a book. Could we pause for a second?
Sure.
Sometimes my allergies kick up just a second.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I swallowed some tea and it went down the wrong pipe.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, we can pick up again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I started writing this in 2017. I did a collection of my short pieces called Two Chairs for Hollywood. And it's a long book, but I wanted to put in some new articles to freshen it up. And I've been thinking for a long time that the Coen brothers were, despite all their fame and glory, they're somewhat misunderstood. And that's usually a reason I write a book. I feel there's been some injustice. Somebody's been ignored or undervalued or misunderstood. So I wrote a 40-page monograph size piece on the Coen brothers and got into the subject. And I took an unusual approach. I decided to watch all their movies again in about 2 weeks, but I did them out of order on purpose. I thought it might be fun to sort of mix them up. And
was it did you watch them in any order? Obviously not chronologically, but or just like spinning the roulette wheel?
No, it's just kind of random. Whatever. I had a pile of them, and I just pulled out the ones I wanted to watch. And but I deliberately wanted to watch them out of order because it just felt right. And that led to a thematic approach. I think I was thinking that already, that rather than go film by film, which I've gotten a little tired of that. That's been the case for director's studies for a long time. And I did critical study.
I was going to say it's more of a defense of the Coen brothers' work in a way, because you bring up all the different critiques or criticisms of the Coen brothers and defend them.
Yeah, I structured it around, I start each section. Well, what I did was I took this long essay, which had been broken up into segments, and each segment was an argument about a certain aspect of the Coen brothers that I felt was misunderstood. And I decided to take arguments against them by various detractors. For example, that they're nihilists, or they're juvenile mockers, or they're shallow, or they engage in insensitive ethnic humor, or various and sundry complaints by their detractors. And I use them as foils, which is a good rhetorical device. I actually learned this from the Jesuit priests when I went to Marquette University High School in Milwaukee. It was a very good Jesuit high school, and it's called the Jesuitical style of argument. I had a really excellent priest teaching me English and, and religion. And one way we argued was, for example, I took a class in religion as a senior is called heresies, which sounds kind of funny today, but it was really a comparative religion class, and it was taught by the smartest priest at the school, Father Charles Shinners. And we studied all the other religions aside from the Catholic religion. And it was a serious class. We were not, it wasn't derogatory toward any other religion. It was trying to understand them. And the point of it was to defend your faith, basically, was the point. You have to, if you're a serious Catholic, you defend your faith against people who don't agree with you. But it became a really interesting intellectual subject. And I began thinking a lot of these religions have some good points, and I began questioning my own religion, which is kind of a unforeseen circumstance resulting from this class. And it was a step toward me breaking away from the church, which was a major a major milestone in my life to free myself from the repressive atmosphere of the church, both sexually and intellectually, etc. And but it opened my mind up to various things. But it taught me this: the way the Jesuits argue is basically you ask the other person what his or her argument is, and then you demolish it. And it's a very good way, because most people don't articulate very well what their position is, and you can easily take it apart. But actually, it's more interesting if the position is more intelligent, because then it's more challenging for you to come up with some good thoughts. And sometimes, as I tell my students, a mixed review is harder to write than a rave or a pan. You know, it's fun to write a rave or a pan, but a mixed review requires a lot of nuance and judgment. And you're not writing reviews when you write film criticism. It's a different thing altogether. It's for people who know the films. But sometimes, you know, the Coens fall into the traps that their detractors do identify. And so I have mixed views on some of the films, and then some of them I like better than others. But that's show business, and people can argue about it. You know, there's certain films that I like that other people are not fond of, and vice versa. And so what I did was I published this long piece on them, and I began thinking, even though, you know, the book keeps selling and a lot of people have bought it, I wanted a wider audience for the part about the Coen brothers. It wasn't really noticed very much because it was in the midst of a long book, and I thought it would get maybe more attention as a you know, standalone thing. So I thought maybe it should be a short book, and I've always wanted to write a short book. Ironically, I've written a couple short books earlier in my life, but the older I get, the longer the books become, because I guess I see more nuances and complexities in life. And, you know, my first book on Orson Welles was 50,000 words, which is not terribly long. It was for
the the Spielberg book isn't really that long. It's
no, that's pretty long.
Was it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's about 500 pages, and it keeps growing because I've done 2 more editions of it.
Oh, I see. I may have an older edition.
Yeah, well, it's a long book because he had.
And everything is, I kind of compare everything to the John Ford book, which might be your most, you know, elaborate of all.
Well, that and my Frank Capra biography was 700 some pages, and Ford was longer, I guess. But I mean, he made 137 films as a director, and he produced a lot of films. Very long career, and Spielberg has had a huge career. And but you know, the Welles book I wrote for the Cinema One series, which was a very good series that the British Film Institute did in the days when, you know, film criticism was starting to get more serious, and they were publishing short books on a lot of important filmmakers and genres. And so I wrote this book on Welles, and then I did one on John Ford with Michael Wilmington, who died recently.
Right.
And we did for the Cinema 2 series, and that was not terribly long. We only wrote about 14 Ford films in depth.
Oh, okay.
We didn't tackle all the films, but in my biography of Ford, I go through every single film. And, you know, some, like The Searchers, I do 21 pages on, and other ones just a few paragraphs. But anyway, the Coen brothers, I wanted to write another short book. I've been carrying around for years. The British critic V.S. Pritchett did a short book on Chekhov when he was in his old age, and it's a short, very pithy, very dense little book, very nicely written. And I thought this is kind of a good model, and I keep trying to write a short book, and I keep writing longer ones. But anyway, so Anthem Press in England contacted me and said, would you like to write a book for us? And we published mostly short books. And I thought, oh, great, I could do the Coen brothers book. And in the meantime, they had come out with The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which I think is one of their, you know, greatest films. And
I was going to mention that I was surprised that seems to be your favorite Coen brothers project.
Well, yeah, it's hard to pick one favorite, but I love that film, and it's a compendium of their work, and it was very convenient for me because, and for them, I guess it's kind of you know, I don't know if they're going to keep working together. They're taking a hiatus from their collaboration, and Joel did The Tragedy of Macbeth, and Ethan is writing plays and short stories, but maybe they'll work together again, maybe they won't. Ethan said, you know, when we started working together, we didn't plan to work together for 40 years. You know, they're just two brothers, and
kind of
brothers don't always have to work together, but it just sort of happened. But what I did was, you know, I wrote about Buster Scruggs. I wrote a long essay on that, and it was a challenge because, again, it's a 6-part film, and it has very different kind of generic approaches. It's various takes on the Western genre. ranging from very parodistic at the beginning to a kind of a takeoff on Sergio Leone films, and then there's a very dark episode with this armless, legless
Oh yeah.
thespian, which is very horrific. And it has this wonderful sort of Fordian wagon train episode that's kind of a film like a classical Western serious drama, very moving, and then it has a very surreal ending. And so they're really exercising all the different muscles creatively and touching on all the different kinds of films they make, because they've made films in many genres. Like, I think of them as the sons of Billy Wilder. You see me in the background interviewing Billy Wilder in 1974 on the set of The Front Page, and he's one of my favorite filmmakers, and I did a book on him recently, Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge. And I think the Coen Brothers are similar to Wilder because they're thank you, social satirists, and they're very trenchant social critics, and they deal with human vice and depravity as satirical artists often do. And they also try different genres. Like Billy Wilder worked in a whole range of genres, and he mixes comedy and drama really well, as the Coens do. And that's one of the criticisms of the Coens by some people, that they don't like their very jarring mixtures of comedy and drama. In the middle of a comedic film, to be some horrific act of violence, for example, and then it'll go back to
and if one right, and I do see that parallel to some degree, Joe, because I was always shocked every time I put on Some Like It Hot. The opening sequence of the Valentine's Day massacre scene is so violent. It's like these guys with Tommy guns shooting down everybody. It's a very bloody, violent scene, you know. And then it goes into this lovely romantic. I mean, it's a romantic comedy, and it's a you know, a bit of a you know, I guess you could say it's worse than a number of levels.
Sex farce, or
a farce for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, it certainly gets very broad, no pun intended.
That's an example. When Billy Wilder was planning the film, he talked to David O. Selznick about it, and Selznick said, "You're crazy to start the film with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, because, geez, it's so violent, and you know, this is a comedy, people are going to be horrified."
Right.
It proved to be a masterstroke, because what Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond, his collaborator, were adapting a German film called Fanfares of Love, which I had to go to Berlin to see. It's so obscure, and they often didn't talk much about it, and they kind of disparaged it, but they actually took a lot from it. It's very different in some ways, but it's very similar in other ways. Two guys join a band. But that film is a contemporary film set in the 50s when it was made. And they don't have a really pressing reason to go and drag. They do it because they're out of work. And it shows a montage of them doing various kind of funny, so-called funny things, like joining a Hawaiian band, or being in blackface, which Wilder said you couldn't do today, you know. But then they're out of work, which is a motive for joining a band. But Diamond said, we need a hammerlock. We need something absolutely life and death, that they can't pull off their wigs and say, I'm a guy. And so the fear of death is their motive for hiding out in disguise in this band. And the gangsters are pursuing them, which adds that suspense dimension. So it really helps make the film very believable, that, you know, you need a motive for why they would do that, and you need the audience to be with them. And it lends a gravity to it as well. It's a serious film underneath its farcical trappings. It's really about a theme that Lubitsch deals with a lot, which is how men should treat women and how women should treat men. But in this case, mostly how men should treat women. Tony Curtis plays a real cad who's used to seducing and abandoning women, and he tries his tricks with Marilyn Monroe, but she's a very likable, sympathetic, but messed up character, and he comes to appreciate her and treat her well, and he kind of reforms his attitude. And also, it's literally a film about what it's like for men to walk around in women's shoes and experience what women go through. And you know, Jack Lemmon says, yeah, these skirts are so drafty. How do they wear them? How do they walk around in these shoes? And then the guy pinches him on the butt, you know, and he says, this is terrible. I mean, you know, they start to have sympathy for women.
Yeah.
And so there's the serious dimension of Wilder, and that's true with the Coen Brothers too, that when they have violent things happening. I mean, Fargo is a very violent film, for example, but it has a kind of comedic tone, a black comedy tone, and parts of it are just very sweet and funny. And the character of Marge, played by Frances McDormand, the police chief, is their most likable character, probably. Somebody who's very good at her job and very honest and sense of integrity. And she is deploring the evil psychopathic violence that she has to deal with, and she handles it well, but she's very disconcerted by it. She's like Ed Tom Bell, the sheriff in No Country for Old Men, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who is an old-fashioned lawman in Texas in 1981, and he has to deal with the face of modern evil, the psychopath played by Javier Bardem, who's a force of nature who can't be stopped. And this the techniques of law and order don't work anymore with this guy. And so Ed Tom Bell is very despondent about the modern world. And it's a very serious film based on Cormac McCarthy's novel. But the two films have that similarity. No Country for Old Men is more somber, but it has a black humor aspect that Josh Brolin's character is this sort of idiot who stumbles upon a drug bust gone bad and makes the mistake of taking the money with him. And he goes into a world full of pain, as John Goodman puts it in The Big Lebowski. This is typical of a lot of Coen Brothers stories. They like their League of Morons, is what it's called in Burn After Reading, which I think is one of their good underrated films. A lot of their characters are kind of dumb or moronic, but they love those characters, and that's one thing people don't understand. They think they're just making fun of these people, but and I've always had a tendency to think that stupidity is not funny. It's kind of sad, but in their case, it's fun because I mean we're all kind of moronic at some level, and we all do really dumb things, and that's kind of what happens. They're cautionary tales. If you took the money at a drug bust, or if you well, in Burn After Reading, these people try to sell national secrets that they find in order to finance Frances McDormand's plastic surgery, which is really stupid. They get into all kinds of trouble. The Russians, they're trying to sell national secrets to the Russians, and they can't believe these people are so stupid. And the secrets are, as one of the Russian guys calls them, drivel. It's the memoirs of a CIA guy who's kind of an idiot too. And Frances McDormand thinks he's saying dribble. That's how they have the wordplay in Coen Brothers films. But that's their typical setup, but it plays out in many different styles and genres.
I had two great examples. I mean, my introduction to the Coen Brothers was actually their second movie. When I saw Raising Arizona. There's both characters. High Nicolas Cage, and Holly.
Ed. Her name is Ed.
Ed, thank you.
Funny names.
And totally. I mean, they were both fall into that category you're talking about. Kind of dumb, but really likable, sweet characters. Even performing, just making terrible choices. They still manage to be utterly likable. You never doubt for a moment that they're good souls. And then on the other side, you do have you have Jerry Lundegaard in Fargo, who's also just couldn't be dumber, making the worst possible choices. In his case, you kind of still on some level root for him as things get worse and worse, even though he's doing just terrible, despicable things.
Yeah, he's kind of everyman character. We can all relate to that. I mean, I mean, it's really an idiotic plan. He has to have his wife kidnapped by two guys to extort money from his father-in-law, which he thinks is a clever idea, but it's just a terrible idea. And the wife winds up dead, and he stumbles into one horrible situation after another. And most of us wouldn't be that dumb, but we can imagine, or we've all done really dumb things in our life, and we regret them. But it's on a level that's more
exaggerated, comical. But you're right; these two filmmakers, if you will, the Coen Brothers being an filmmaking entity, and Billy Wilder, masters of tone, where it's just almost even with their failures, there is or less successful films, if you will. They're really just, I don't know. I think tone wise, they're really aiming for the stars. And sometimes you don't just get it exactly right, but you can't blame them for not.
Oh yeah. Well, they're trying difficult things. Wilder, I'll give you a great example. I asked Wilder in 1995, I presented him with the Career Achievement Award from the LA Film Critics, and I was having lunch with him. And I said, what do you think is your best film? And he said, The Apartment. And I said, why? And he said, because I think it's my best mixture of comedy and drama.
My favorite.
It's a wonderful film. And he said, that's what I've been trying for all my life, that mixture. And Diamond mentioned a scene that is really pivotal, where Jack Lemmon is very despondent about the girl he loves. As he finds out she's having an affair with his boss in his own apartment, and so he goes out and gets drunk on Christmas Eve. It's a very sad scene, but it's funny. It's it's kind of, we've all been there, but it's so extreme that it becomes funny. And then he meets this dizzy woman named Margie, played by Hope Holiday, who is wonderful in that scene. It's an immortal classic short scene where he picks her up in the bar and they're both having kind of drunken discussion. And Wilder, she told me Wilder directed them. She said, he said, don't look at each other, just stare straight ahead. They're looking into a mirror that we don't see. And that adds to the alienation you feel. And, it's like when you pick up somebody in a bar, you don't know them very well, but you're both drunk and they're both lonely, but it's all very comical. And then he takes her home and he finds out, when he's going to seduce her in his apartment, that Shirley MacLaine is in the apartment. She's overdosed and she's dying. And it's a very near tragic scene. And he rushes next door to get the doctor who lives next door. And poor Hope Holiday.
I believe the doctor is Jewish.
Yeah, he's one of the.
I'm kidding.
Well, he's one of the most overtly Jewish characters in a Wilder film, and he's a very humane guy, and that's part of the meaning of the film, that he teaches Jack Lemmon's character to be a mensch. Lemmon's character is a waspy guy from Cincinnati, and but he's told to be a mensch, be a man, and he learns how to do that. And that's the journey a lot of Wilder characters take, from being a screw up and a guy who partakes in vice, to being an honest man with integrity, which he basically is.
Integrity is the thing. It's like a little bit of a weak spot, an Achilles heel for these characters, but they just need that kind of the push, the little bit of a nudge in the right direction.
Yeah, and in his case, I mean, he's like a teacher, and he kind of teaches him how to behave, and he's chiding him, and the humor comes from the fact that the doctor thinks, and his wife think, that Lemmon is a big ladies' man because women are constantly coming through his apartment. But in reality, he's this poor schmuck who can't get laid, And so, but he loves MacLaine, and then he finds her overdosed, and so he's running off to get the doctor. And Hope Holliday's character is saying, "Wait a minute, where are you going?" And at one point she says, "You need a refrigerator because all he has is ice without." It's kind of a mess, and he runs out the door, and she says, "I didn't mean right away," and it's farcical humor. And Diamond said, we were very concerned about that scene, that it was a blend of farce and near tragedy, and it was intersecting and literally running out. He's trying to pull her out the door, and she loses her shoe, and she told me she was skidding on the linoleum floor, and she was trying to put her shoe on at the same time. That wasn't planned, and it's a nice touch. And she doesn't understand why he's rushing her out the door, and she has no idea about the tragedy that's taking place. And so it's this. Diamond said, if this worked, the film would work, and if it didn't work, the film would probably flop. And so he said, we were holding our breath at the premiere, or at the preview, that it would work, and it worked really well. So that's the kind of blend they're after. And if you think about it, if they hadn't had the humorous scene where he picks up the girl and brings her back to the apartment, it would have been a straight dramatic scene. And Wilder said, I always thought of the apartment as a serious drama, not a comedy, but there is that comedic element that adds kind of a real life complication. I think in screenwriting, I often tell my students to think of John Lennon's comedy. He said, life is what happens when you're making other plans.
Or I use this expression a lot lately, we make plans and God laughs.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Or what's the other way of putting it? Man proposes, God disposes. Yeah, it's another way of putting it. But yeah, in other words,
Right.
we're trying to do something serious and then something comical happens to us, or vice versa. We're
You know,
we're having fun and then we get a phone call that somebody we know is dying or something like that. That's the way life is, and films that blend that, I think, have a more lifelike sense. Frank Capra at his best does that too. That's one reason I like It's a Wonderful Life, for example, blends comedy and
it's very
really
dark,
dark drama, and the
very dark.
Coens do
Yeah.
that really well.
I mean, you have suicidal ideation in both, or not just ideation, attempts in both films, actually, which is a 1940s, whatever. I mean, and then
Well, you think of
The Apartment's a little later, of course, but
you think suicide and comedy are not supposed to go together, but they do. And It's a Wonderful Life. William S. Pechter is a critic who wrote about Capra in 1962, and he said, if you don't believe in angels, it's a film about a man committing suicide, which I think is a very good comment, because I think it's hampered by the supernatural apparatus, which is sort of Capra escaping from reality. But if you strip that away, that Deus Ex Machina element, Jimmy Stewart is a suicidal man who jumps off a bridge, and he's despondent about his life, and the despondency is portrayed really vividly and powerfully.
right. It is,
and yet it's considered a really beloved film. And one of the things I think is
Christmas movie, the most popular Christmas movie.
Yeah, I was going to say that some of the most popular Christmas movies, and you can add The Apartment, takes place around Christmas, and there's a girl committing suicide on Christmas Eve. Christmas is the time of year when the most murders and suicides take place, because a lot of people feel despondent. If you're alone,
Right.
or if your life is not going well, you feel really terrible.
And you're just watching everybody with their families. It's very isolating, sure.
Yeah, or you could have a problem with your family on Christmas, and people are very emotional at that time, and so it's a good time to make a film about.
I want to bring something up about Wilder. We've been kind of toggling between these two books and the two filmmakers, or three with the Coen Brothers, but because we're kind of talking tone and how successful they all are at it. I want to bring something up that about Wilder, and this idea of how austere or meticulous he was with his actors following his scripts, the scripts as given to them, and then this idea of improvisation. And I think one thing that a lot of people may not get is that, yes, he didn't want his actors to improvise. He wanted them to follow the letter. And I think Diamond, right? Is he Diamond? Is that what he was?
Well,
he was on the set to kind of like make sure that while Wilder was more kind of looking at the blocking and maybe other things, he wasn't paying as much attention. But I wanted to say that if there was a happy accident that really worked, that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily an improvisation. It's an accident, and if it worked, he would happily include it in his films.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, most directors who are good can do that, but Wilder and Diamond were very strict about following the script, as was Wilder with his previous collaborator, Charles Brackett.
Yeah.
Diamond, by the way, his son, Paul, who's a screenwriter, gave me some very good interviews about his father, said his father liked to be called Iz, and he didn't like to be called Izzy. He said he only tolerated that nickname from Jack Lemmon. But Iz Diamond, his name was Itek Damnici, and he was Romanian, and the first day of school, he didn't speak any English, and the teacher said, "You're going to be called Isidore," and that's how he got his name. And he changed it to I.A.L. because when he was at Columbia University, he was writing for the school magazine, and one of his editors changed his name to Ian Diamond, and he said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, your name is too Jewish. We didn't want another Jewish name in the paper." And ironically, the editor was Jewish. But Diamond he went home and he started thinking of variations on Ian, and he came up with I.A.L. He thought it was funny, to have initials. And he was a math whiz, and he had won a competition from the International Algebraic League, I.A.L. And some people think that's where he got his name. And his son said that wasn't really the case, but he pretended that if people asked. Anyway, that's backstory about it. Diamond was quite an interesting man, brilliant comic writer. but he, I was on the set of the front page, as you can see in this picture, and Diamond was sitting on a little stool right off the set, and he had the script in front of him, and he was like professor. He looked like a professor, and he was a very serious kind of guy, and he was the keeper of the script. And if the actors deviated one word from the script, he had the power to interrupt them and call out, "Excuse me, you know, you got to say this." And I noticed Walter Matthau, this is an interesting variation. You can see how it works. He had to tell the sheriff. He said, "We're going to throw you out on your on your uh, on your can," I think was the line. And then
we're going to throw you out on your quiche.
Yeah, well, he changed it to, "We're going to throw you out on your big fat can."
Oh, right.
And then he looked at Diamond at one point. He said, "Oh, you know, I added big fat, didn't I?" And Diamond sort of sniffed, and he said, "Yeah, I noticed that, but I didn't say anything, so you can keep it in." So it seemed more natural to Matthau to add big fat can, and the rhythm of it works, you know. And so there is a certain flexibility, but the way Diamond put it was, we didn't think that actors could come up with a better line than we thought of, spending months in the office, you know, going.
And they were right.
Yeah. And he said, if you ever listen to actors talk, you will not allow them to improvise, is the way he put it. You know, because if, like, the Academy Awards ceremony last year was about the worst one I ever saw. And I always wished that the speeches were allowed to go on longer, because I like the speeches most on those shows. But that year, Steven Soderbergh let everybody talk at great length, and it was extremely dull and boring because actors just rambled and were inarticulate and repetitive, most of them. And I began thinking, wait a minute, I'm wrong. It's a good reason that they have, you know, a clock to keep them on track. And when I wrote 5 AFI Life Achievement Award shows with the producer, George Stevens Jr., and we had a lot of great stars and directors on those shows. I wrote shows for Jimmy Stewart, John Huston, Frank Capra, Fred Astaire, Lillian Gish. And
amazing.
So I said to George, I was a little naive when I started, "How does it work? Do the actors come in with speeches or what?" And he laughed and he said, "Joe, these are actors. They need lines. We have to write something for them. You know, they don't know what to say." And what I would do, though, is often I'd go and talk to the actors and kind of pump them for stories and thoughts. And then I'd sit down and write something that was, you know, tried to sound like coming out of their head. You know, I'm pretty good at mimicking people's talk. And, but sometimes they had nothing to say. Like Betty Davis, when we honored Frank Capra, part of my job was to go and get people to be on the show. And sometimes it was like the Sunshine Boys. I had to reunite people who hated each other. And Betty Davis and Capra wound up hating each other after doing Pocketful of Miracles. But she agreed to be on the show. But we said, "What do you have to say about Capra?" And she said, "I have nothing to say, just write something." So I thought, well, we could use her, since she's a great actress, to talk about why Capra is a great director. And so I wrote a speech and made it sound like Betty Davis. And George read the speech to her over the phone, and she said, "Perfect." And I thought that was very nice. And then she showed up at the rehearsal the next day, and we always rehearsed with them in case there was some problem. And sometimes we tinker with the lines. And she came up to me. She's a tiny little lady, which was surprising, because on screen she's formidable.
This was post-stroke, right? So
well, she was in pretty good shape at that time. She hadn't had her really serious stroke at that point.
Okay.
But she was in good form. I think it was pre-stroke. But anyway, she said, "You know, I hope you don't mind, I like your speech, but I changed a few words." And I said, "Geez, you know, you're Betty Davis. I'm glad you did that, because we want their participation to some extent to make it sound like them." And if she said something that didn't work, or repeated something somebody else said or whatever, I would work with them to alter the lines so that it didn't get out of control. But that's what Wilder and Diamond would do. And I worked with Orson Welles as an actor for 5 years, and he did a different thing with me. He let me talk to him for an hour or so before every scene. And I played a guy who was a young film historian following John Huston around, who played a legendary old director. And I was supposed to be writing a book about him. And so I'm asking him sort of foolish film buff questions. that irritate the old guy. And Welles thought it'd be fun to have me come up with the questions because, you know, I was the kind of guy that, you know, it was kind of, I was exaggerating my own personality. So I would throw out
We're
questions.
talking about The Other Side of the Wind for those.
Yeah, The Other Side of the Wind. Thanks for mentioning the title. So I would throw out questions and Welles would pick and choose ones. Oh, yeah, that's funny. And then he would rewrite them to make them sound a little more pompous or whatever. And then he'd type it up. And then I had to read the lines exactly the way he wrote them. I couldn't deviate one syllable, and I also had to follow his blocking. Literally, I couldn't do anything. One time I thought I'd add something. I went like this with my nose. I thought this was like Marlon Brando method acting. It shows you how limited an actor I was. And he said, "What are you doing? What are you rubbing your nose for?" You know, in other words, it's not in the script. So I was very rigid in terms of, Keith Baxter said most directors, they either move the actors or move the camera, but Welles is always moving the actors and the camera at the same time, which is tricky for the actors. And so I had to follow the marks, and you know, I was putty in Welles's hands because he's a really great actors director, and I was a neophyte. But that was a rare instance of a director letting an actor collaborate on the dialogue. Jean Renoir, one other thing I'll say about directing actors, he said, and I think this is a great lesson for screenwriters, he said, you should always change the part to fit the actor and not change the actor to fit the part. In other words, you have an actor, sometimes you have the perfect actress, sometimes it's a compromise, or you have somebody who is surprising to you, and you rewrite the part for the actor as you're working. But Wilder and Diamond would do some of that, but they didn't do much of that. They were very into control. And the Coen brothers are like that too, according to actors who work with them. But actors have said, like John Turturro said, it's a real freedom. And Tim Blake Nelson, who's in Buster Scruggs,
and Brother, Where Art Thou?
Right. He said it's a great feeling of freedom because you know what you're doing, you know what the lines are, but within that, they let you kind of act it out the way you feel is right. And there's a kind of a subtle tone that you impart to the character. And then, you know, a director is kind of a taste machine. Like if he doesn't like the tone of something, he can say, like Robert Mitchum was on our Houston show, and he said all Houston would say is even more. And Mitchum would say even more, and Houston would say even more, or even less, a little less, kid, a little less, you know. But that's the kind of molding. But then there are directors like George,
Robert.
Yeah, a little more. But George Cukor would talk at great length to his actors and give them all kinds of thoughts, and that's his style. They all have their own styles, but Coen brothers are in the Billy Wilder tradition of having very beautifully, carefully composed scripts that the actors are expected to follow.
What year was Buddy Buddy?
1981.
What year was Blood Simple?
Oh, Blood Simple. That was in the mid 70s. Let me just check.
No.
Well, wait. No. What am I thinking of? Blood Simple was 1984. That was their first film. Yeah.
So, yeah, right. Well, that's what I was trying to get at. So I was just saying, I was wondering, and of course, I think Wilder probably lived, it's possible that Wilder saw Blood Simple.
Yeah, I think, you know, and actually the film that reminds me most of Wilder that they did, I don't think it's one of their best movies, but Intolerable Cruelty is very much a kind of subject that Billy Wilder might have wanted to tackle. It's a kind of a crooked divorce lawyer played by George Clooney, and a gold digger, Beverly Hills mercenary kind of woman who marries rich guys and divorces them. And they fall in love, and they're both operating these scams. It's very much like a Billy Wilder subject. And this kind of...
Right, yeah, that's true. It's the closest maybe to
Wilder, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he could have really gone for it. It's really a commentary, an oblique commentary on marriage.
Double Indemnity, maybe, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a very oblique commentary on relationships. Like, here's a really poisonous, violent relationship, and it's kind of a commentary on what a relationship shouldn't be. But Intolerable Cruelty is also a commentary on marriage. There's a kind of a economic factor in marriage. You know, people marry people if they're solvent. I mean, or sometimes they marry people for money in a very mercenary way, and that corrupts the institution of marriage. And so there's a serious undertone beneath the satire. And I think Wilder would have responded to that if he had been around. He could have done a film like that.
I guess I was just trying to. I had this idea it would be pretty cool if Billy Wilder had seen a Coen Brothers movie. You know, like that would it be?
I don't know if he did, because
How would
one
you?
thing, he liked to knock modern Hollywood because he was excluded from modern Hollywood. I think that was a big scandal that he couldn't get a film made after 1981. Buddy Buddy was not a good film, and he took it on as an assignment. It wasn't something that he really wanted to do, but
Yeah.
it's not funny at all. And people wondered, did he lose his touch? And I felt, after thinking about it a lot, that he could have made it funny if he had wanted to. I think he just felt like, screw this, this is a horrible idea for a film. I'm just gonna make it.
It's hard to imagine him like. Well, this was done without, I guess, right? I.A.L. Diamond, I assume.
Oh, Diamond wrote it with him.
Oh, it did. He did. Because I'm thinking, like, with Mathau and Lemon, is who he's now worked with. Well, he worked with on the Fortune Cookie. And and then did he work with Math and the Front Page?
Well, the Front Page and a number of other films, but I think he could have made it funny if he'd wanted to. To me, it's like a Samuel Beckett play. It's so bleak. It's really grim. It's a hitman played by Mathau, who's really miscast, and a suicidal guy played by Lemon, who's kind of in his way all the time. He's trying to get rid of him. There's only one funny line. I read the script before the film came out, and I laughed aloud only once. There's a sex clinic. It's a kind of a funny idea, but it's not really funny on screen. Klaus Kinski, of all people, runs a sex clinic out in the desert, and he's this, very perverse German actor. And
my best fiend.
Paula Prentice is Jack Lemmon's wife, and she's driven. He's a censor for CBS. He's very prudish, and so she goes and joins the sex clinic and gets involved in all kinds of wild sexual things. And anyway, they have a workshop on premature ejaculation, and Klaus Kinski is leading a discussion with these guys about how they avoid premature ejaculation. One guy says, "I think about Willie Mays," that's an old joke, and somebody says something else, and one guy says, "I think about Richard Nixon." And he said, "No," he says, "I think about Watergate." And then another guy puts up his hand and says, "Watergate makes me come." And I cracked up when I read that. I thought that's really a funny line. And then it's not in the film. Oddly enough, the one funny line in the script is not in the film. Apparently, Wilder had a lot of trouble with Kinski, who was a difficult actor, and the scenes seemed very choppy, and some of the best stuff might not have been filmed or left on the cutting room floor.
Well, after working on 2 films with Marilyn Monroe, you'd think anything would be much easier.
He had some other actors who were difficult sometimes, but Mart Keller on Fedora was extremely hard to direct.
Mart Keller, yeah.
She was incompetent, in my opinion, and gave a terrible performance. And I think in a weird way, I would prefer a better actress in the title role of Fedora, but in a weird way, her foundering and her hysteria and her anxiety work for the film, because she plays somebody who is not suited to be a star. She's the daughter of this old star who's passing off her daughter as herself, and she's not a trained actress, and she doesn't want to do it, and she's a drug addict and everything. And so Mart Keller doesn't know what to do with her hands. She's waving her hands around all the time, and she's moving her head around, and it's just a really bad performance, but it's kind of poignant in a weird way. It kind of works for the film. But Buddy Buddy, the point I was going to make was, after Buddy Buddy, Wilder lived another 21 years and couldn't get a film made. And I go into some of the projects he had, and some were kind of bizarre, but a couple of them could have been very funny. One was about a guy modeled on H.B. Warner, the actor who played Jesus in Cecil B. DeMille's silent film, The King of Kings, in 1927. And he was reputed to be a alcoholic and a lecher. And he would run off to Tijuana to go to whorehouses and get drunk every weekend while he was playing Jesus. And the gag of the film is that they don't want him causing a scandal. This is a Cecil B. DeMille film, and they didn't want Jesus to be caught in a raid on a whorehouse or something. And so they, actually, in the movie, he's doing all this stuff in Los Angeles where it's risky to be caught, and so they let him sneak off to Tijuana under supervision to indulge himself, and then he goes back to playing Jesus, and he's hitting on everybody on the set. And the actress who plays the Virgin Mary is screwing him, but the actress who plays Mary Magdalene will not screw him. You know, and Walter Matthau was going to play the publicist who's trying to control this
Oh,
actor.
wow.
It
Okay.
sounded like a funny idea.
I
Wilder,
wonder who we could have cast as Jesus, because
well, Warner was this sort of skinny, you know, ascetic looking guy. He played this pharmacist in It's Wonderful Life, if you remember.
who?
H.B. Warner. He was a good character actor. He's in Frank Capra films. He's in Lost Horizon and other films.
So this script actually was from what, earlier?
No,
It never got made.
This is in the 80s.
Oh, so it was after Buddy Buddy, when during the phase where he was trying to develop things unsuccessfully.
Well, actually, he talked to me about it in the 70s. I interviewed Wilder quite a lot, and it was a project he was working on in the 70s that he really wanted to do. And I said, what's it about? And he said, well, it's about the Mayer family. It's roots. He was kidding. It's kind of the roots of Hollywood. And he said he wanted to call it the Foreskin Saga, which I thought was a very good pun. And but it was kind of a mockery of Hollywood, and I think that might have been a good idea. But he also wanted to do a film on Lepetamain, who was this famous French music hall performer in the Belle Epoque, who his entire act consisted of farting in different ways. He was a virtuoso of farting, and he would do musical numbers, play La Marseillaise, etc., by farting and things like that. And it sounds like a very strange idea for a film. He was a popular artist, but a 2-hour movie about this guy would be very hard to pull off. And Wilder apparently was serious about it. He kept pitching it to people, and nobody would go for it, you know. So sometimes I think some of his later projects were kind of like "fuck you" to Hollywood projects, you know. And I think that's what Buddy Buddy was. It's kind of like, you know, you want farting jokes, I'll give you the 2-hour farting joke, you know. He was so bitter about Hollywood. And the reason I think that is Diamond mentioned at an AFI seminar, he said, we watch a film like Blazing Saddles and we find it very strange that people go into hysterics over a bunch of cowboys sitting around the campfire farting. You know, we don't think that's funny. So why would he make a whole film about that? I think it's kind of just a way of expressing contempt for modern Hollywood. But, you know, the point I was going to make when you mentioned, did he see a Coen Brothers film? I compiled a list that I put in my Billy Wilder book of modern films that he did like. There were a lot of current films he liked. And in Fedora, there's a line where William Holden's old producer, who's kind of a stand-in for Wilder and Diamond, says the kids with beards have taken over and they don't have a script and they improvise and they use handheld cameras. And apparently Diamond wrote that line that they really felt contemptuous of some of the self-indulgent young directors. But who's the ultimate director with the beard at that time? Francis Ford Coppola, a great director. And Wilder said Godfather 2 he thought was one of the 5 best films ever made in America, which may be true. So he really valued certain films. And he liked Quiz Show, for example. He liked he had a lot of films that he liked. I have a long list of them, but none of them is a Coen Brothers film, so I'm not sure if he ever saw one or not.
Okay. I bet he did. If you saw Quiz Show, maybe.
Yeah, he saw a lot of films. He was a member of the Academy, and he kept up on the films.
Although Blood Simple, of course, you know, was probably a little under the radar for a lot of, you know, establishment Hollywood people. It may be Raising Arizona kind of catapulted them into the mainstream.
Yeah,
and then, you know, right.
Blood Simple was, you know, it's a film noir, and Wilder made, you know, the ultimate film noir with Double Indemnity, or one of the first important film noir.
Oh, absolutely.
Titles, and so he might have kept up with that or not. But let me just say, I'm looking at my list here of some films he liked. He liked Julia by his old friend Fred Zinnemann. He liked Annie Hall. He liked Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He liked The Lost Honor of Katharina Bloom. The Full Monty, American Beauty, Das Boot, the Japanese film Shall We Dance, even like Forrest Gump, which I think is a strange choice because it's sort of
I can't believe you. Wait, what year was that? How?
Well, in the 90s, he liked that. To me, it's a schmaltzy right-wing film.
Wilder, what year did he die?
2002.
He died in 2002.
Yeah. And then I mentioned other directors he liked. He liked Hal Ashby, Martin Scorsese, Barry Levinson, and Bernardo Bertolucci. So
he was around. So he was around for quite a few of the.
Well, my point is that
Coen
he
Brothers
was
movies.
not a narrow-minded guy. He liked a lot of modern
Right.
films, but
Oh, no, true, right.
he didn't like certain schlocky films. Like he mentioned to me the Gauntlet, the Clint Eastwood film, which he said was like a mad goulash of all the crazy scenes you could think of thrown together, violent stuff and ridiculous stuff. And
Yeah.
he said, I don't go out to see those films. I watch them on cable, you know, but he kind of wondered it. And then he said things like American Graffiti was a good film, but he said I couldn't do a film like that because even if I tried, I couldn't, you know, I'm not a young guy and I couldn't make a film like that, but I admire it. But if I tried to make it, it would be foolish, you know. So I just read an interview with Richard Lester, who made a point that I made in my book, that he said Wilder was functioning in a certain kind of social structure for a long time, and he had an oblique take on it. And but then the structure totally collapsed in the 60s, and Wilder was left with an emptiness to rebel against, and he was seen as irrelevant and passe. And he said that's shows you how bad the situation was, that a man of such immense sophistication was seen as irrelevant. So what Wilder, my take is that he was the bull in the china shop of American Puritanism in the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s. He was smashing all the china. But by the end of the 60s, the production code was gone. You could say or do almost anything in a film.
There was no more China.
Yeah, there's no more China. The China shop was empty. And so what did he do? He didn't go the route of making extreme violent films or Last Tango in Paris or something like that. He made romantic films. He went into more romantic direction, which was very unfashionable. And I remember in the late 60s, early 70s, if people wanted to insult you, they'd say, oh, you're really romantic, by which they meant you were kind of a sap and you were
Sentimental.
Out of touch with reality, sentimental.
Yeah.
But Wilder was romantic because romantic people are ones who have a kind of an ideal about humanity that they hope will live up to it. But Diamond said he was a disappointed romantic, which I think is a good definition of Wilder, that he he'd been burned too often by life. He'd been through, you know, he came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire that collapsed. He went through World War I as a kid, you know, struggling for food. And then he lived through Weimar Germany, and then he fled Hitler and had to go to France. Then he came to America. So he was in exile several times over. And his mother and stepfather died in killed by the Nazis. And so he was lived through a lot of the darkest times of the 20th century, and he was not a Pollyanna. And I think sometimes people who criticize him for being cynical are kind of Pollyannas. They want a rosy view of life. And I once mistakenly used the word cynical about his work. I said, your romanticism is disguised under a certain cynicism. And he said, but if I'm cynical, what adjective do you have for Peckinpah pictures? A wonderful line. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't mean to stigmatize you with that word, but I said, cynical is just another word for realistic, isn't it? And he said, yeah. You know, he said, every play by Ibsen is cynical, right? Every play by Strindberg is cynical. And he also had a comment somewhere else. He said, if you're not a dope running around Hollywood grinning all the time, people think you're a cynic, you know?
Yeah, I know actors who have to always be, you know, positive, and they can't criticize anything and they can't complain, because then automatically they're labeled as difficult and as a complainer. You know, it's just,
well, it's part of
related to that, you know.
It's part of our culture. You know, the Twilight Zone show, It's a Good Life. You've probably seen that one. Classic show about the little kid played by Billy Mumy, who wishes
Mumy.
people, Mumy, is it pronounced? He wishes people into the cornfield if he doesn't like them.
Yeah, right. I do remember that.
You know, and everybody walks around terrified of this little kid, and if they say the wrong thing, he frowns at them, and they go out.
It was the original cancel culture, Joe.
Yeah, cancel culture, right? And a friend of mine who's an assistant director said that it to him is a perfect metaphor for Hollywood. Everybody is terrified all the time, and they're walking around worried about people disapproving of them, and they're afraid to say anything. And because
it's the cornfield.
Yeah, I was just reading, you know, this thing about the Academy relegating 8 categories to, you know, not live coverage. They're going to pre-tape 8 categories on the show, which is an outrage against certain crafts. And in the Hollywood Reporter article about industry reaction against it, every single source except maybe one was anonymous, and they all said some producer wanted anonymity out of fear of retaliation. You know, to say
Exactly.
the editors should be
ridiculous.
Should be live on the show. Production designers should be. That's fear of retaliation. You know, they're afraid to criticize the Academy. That's how bad it is. And so that's why Hollywood films don't deal with serious social issues very much. Like, you know, a film like The Grapes of Wrath, made in 1940, is a very radical film, and they wouldn't make that today. People would be afraid of it today. You know, I was just watching a George Cukor film called Susan and God, which was made in 1940. It's a very good satire based on a play by Rachel Crothers. It's about a society woman who finds Jesus, played by Joan Crawford, and she's very funny, and she's this kind of, she gets fanatical about Jesus, and it's a comedy, and she drives her friends crazy because she's trying to proselytize.
Yeah.
She's trying to proselytize, and she breaks up marriages and all kinds of stuff, and then she realizes at some point she's wrong. But back in around 1982, when I was a screenwriter, I went to MGM and I said, I had a meeting with a vice president of MGM who was a story editor, and she wanted me to do a project for them. And I said, why don't we remake Susan and God? It would be a very funny movie. I had a good idea because I had a girlfriend at the time who was kind of a Jesus freak, and I had some ideas to modernize this. It would have been really interesting. And this executive was just horrified. Oh my God, we can't make a film like that because it would offend the fundamentalist Christians. We can't do that. And this is 1982. It shows you back in 1940, they had more courage. George Cukor said, you know, the people say the studios were repressive, but they actually took some chances on material, you know, and I'm kind of amazed they made that film back in 1940. It's a good satire of religion, but it didn't do very well at the box office, but nobody got, you know, nobody boycotted the film or anything. But in 1982, they couldn't do that. And today, if you took that in, or a film that I co-wrote, Rock and Roll High School, which ends with the kids blowing up the school, you couldn't do that today. You know, you take that in today and they would say no. But it took some doing for us to get it done, because when I proposed that ending to the director, Alan Arkish, and it was based on the students blowing up a building when I was at the University of Wisconsin. I was a newspaper reporter in Madison. They blew up the Army Mathematics Research Center, which was planning bombing raids in Vietnam. And they killed a graduate student. It was really a tragic occurrence that hurt the anti-war movement. So I said, let's have the kids blow up the school at the end. And I didn't mean to celebrate it. Alan, to this day, misunderstands the ending. He thinks it's a celebration of anarchy.
Right.
What I was trying to get at was revolutions quickly can get out of control and become destructive. But anyway, at first reaction was, he said, oh, we can't do that because the students would appear unsympathetic. And so I had to figure out, how do I trick him into doing this? Because I thought it was really a great ending. And Roger Corman later said that was the whole reason he agreed to do the film. But my girlfriend at the time was a journalist who was on the set of film. She went on the set of a film called Over the Edge, which was directed by Jonathan Kaplan. And it was a serious film about juvenile delinquents in a suburb, and the parents, to mollify them, keep them out of trouble, built a little recreation center, and the kids didn't like it, so they set fire to it. At the end, it's a very tragic ending. And I said, I said to myself, oh, okay, I've got it now, because Jonathan Kaplan had graduated from the Roger Corman School of Directors into the big and all the directors who worked for Roger hated the directors who had escaped into the major studios. So I said to Alan,
we're going to get to one of them in a little bit.
Yeah, I said to Kaplan is doing this film where they burn down a little building at the end. We have to top Jonathan Kaplan. We have to blow up a high school. And he said, yeah, let's top Jonathan Kaplan. Let's blow up the high school. That's how I got my way on that film, but it was a struggle.
Speaking of directors who, I don't know, graduated from the Roger Corman University or College of
Clown College,
alternate budget filmmaking. You know, I wanted to talk about, maybe we can do this in the last portion here, and but first we can remind people of the two books we've been talking about. And there's others.
Yeah, I've got actually 4 books out this fall in this early part of the year.
What are the other two? We have the Billy Wilder Dancing on the Edge, which we talked about.
Yeah,
the Coen Brothers, The Whole Durn Human Comedy, is that what it was
Yeah,
called?
the Whole Durn Human Comedy, Life According to the Coen Brothers, critical study from Anthem Press, and Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge is a longer critical study from
Columbia?
Columbia University Press.
Yeah.
And I also did a book called Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career in 2006 for University Press of Kentucky. And I updated it. It's the first paperback printing. It came out in January, and I did a new epilogue because of The Other Side of the Wind has finally come out after 48 years. And so I did a critique of that and partly an account of how it was made and finished, because about a third of that book is on The Other Side of the Wind, so it ties it together.
Oh,
And also I wrote about his early film, Too Much Johnson, which was rediscovered miraculously in an Italian warehouse, of all things. It was thought lost since 1938. And it's a silent film of about 66 minutes long, so it's kind of a feature he made before Citizen Kane, and it's a pastiche of silent comedies. And he loved Max Sennett and other Harold Lloyd, and it's a charming film, really well shot. It shows to his, he claimed he was a cinematic version when he made Citizen Kane a version, but he actually knew a lot about filmmaking. It's a very sophisticated, well shot film. And I had discovered an earlier film he did called The Hearts of Age, which was an amateur film he made in 1934. And he was not happy at all that I found that film, because it helped dispel the myth that he had no film experience. And every few months he would ask Gary Graver, his cameraman, he'd say, why did Joe have to discover that film? You know, so these are kind of bookends for his career. Too Much Johnson, rediscovered early film, and Other Side of the Wind, finally put together by a intrepid team of producers and a great editor, Bob Murawski. I was a consultant on the completion, along with Jonathan Rosenbaum, who's another Welles critic, and we gave advice on how to finish it, and it came out really well. I think I have a few reservations, but it was done in the style of Welles's editing. He edited 41 minutes of the film, and so Bob Murawski followed his template for editing the framing story of the party and then the film with it.
Yeah, no, I think there's a great continuity there.
Yeah, he did a wonderful job. Bob was a great editor. And then I did a book called Political Truth, The Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. And that came out in December. I self-published that. I occasionally self-publish a book. I've done 4 of those. Those are books that are kind of too offbeat for regular publishers to tackle. And I've done 2 books on the Kennedy assassination. If you do a book that says that the Warren Commission was full of it, no regular publisher will touch it, or almost none. But I wanted complete freedom, so I studied this subject from 10 minutes after the assassination. Actually, even earlier, I wrote a short story about Kennedy's assassination in October 1961. When I was a freshman in high school, I had worked as a volunteer on his 1960 presidential primary campaign in Wisconsin. And I met him a couple of times. I was struck by how he had almost no security. And I was a student of the Lincoln assassination, and I worried about his safety.
Right.
And so I wrote this short story in 2 years before it happened, about what if he were assassinated. And then when he got shot, I heard about it from a guy in the cafeteria line. I ran to a radio and started listening to the radio. And from 12:40 to 1 o'clock, they kept saying the shots came from the front, from the hill or the railroad bridge. And then at 1 o'clock, they started saying all the shots came from behind, from the Texas School Book Depository building. And I wondered, I was a journalist already. And when they start changing a story without an explanation, red flags go up in my mind of what's going on here, you know. And by the end of the day, I didn't believe the official story. So I've been a critic of the media since day one. And when I did my book Into the Nightmare, which came out in 2013, which is my big study of the assassination and the murder of Officer Tippit the same day.
Right. Later, Oswald supposedly shot this cop.
Yeah, he was blamed for killing Kennedy and Tippit. I don't think he did either shooting. And actually, I interviewed Henry Wade, the DA of Dallas County, and Jim Lavelle, who was the lead detective in the Tippit case. Both of them indicated to me that Captain Will Fritz, who is the head of homicide for the Dallas Police Department, indicated to them the first day that they didn't really have a case on Oswald for shooting Kennedy. There was really no evidence. And so they should work up a case on him for shooting the policeman. And I asked Lavelle, well, what did you have on that? And he said, well, we had witnesses. And there were some witnesses who said Oswald did it. And then there were others who said 2 men did it. And then other people said they wouldn't identify Oswald, et cetera. It was a very complicated case. But they did not arraign Oswald on the Kennedy murder. They charged him with both murders, but they only arraigned him on the murder of Tippit. But the first day they told the world that he had killed the policeman and the president. But, you know, this was a ginned up charge against him for shooting Kennedy, and also the Tippit murder. I don't think he did it, and there are a lot of doubts and mysteries. What I found out was that Tippit and another policeman, William Menzel, were sent by the Dallas police very shortly after the assassination, sent to Oak Cliff, a suburb, to track down Oswald. Particularly, they knew who he was. And that indicates conspiracy, because the official story is they didn't know who Oswald was until 2:10, when they got him into the police department downtown and identified him. But they knew who he was because they had been tracking him. And
well, they would have known anybody who traveled to Russia, right?
Yeah, he was,
and brought back a Russian wife, and I mean,
yeah, they had, you know, a squad of people who were investigating characters they thought were suspicious. But he was an FBI informant, I found out too. He was infiltrating the plot for the FBI, but they wanted to make him the scapegoat. So as early as 1245, they sent Tippit and Menzel after him. And it's not clear whether they were supposed to kill him or capture him. I think they're probably supposed to kill him. But Tippit drove into a police ambush, and then they set that up, and all kinds of policemen poured into that area and arrested Oswald. So anyway, I did that book, but I've been studying the mendacity of the mainstream media all these years, how they've constantly lied to us. The main culprits are the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS. And, you know, the mainstream media keeps saying, well, you know, it's a lone gunman, Warren Commission had it right. But then there's the whole slew of independent researchers and independent journalists who are trying to get the actual facts out. And so it's a long study of that. I'm very proud of that book. I put a lot of work into it, a lot of research, and that came out, Political Truth. So I've had 4 books that came out almost simultaneously. It's been a very busy period.
You're your own worst competitor.
Yeah.
Hey, well, let's talk a little bit about, you know, Peter Bogdanovich, because there's another person who you had a relationship with. You have worked together on The Other Side of the Wind. In fact, you got his original role, correct? He was originally, not wasn't quite. That the way it was originally set up? No.
Well, not exactly. He and I were both cast. The first day of shooting was Peter and me, basically as a pair of squabbling film critics.
Okay.
And we shot at Welles's rented home in LA, and in a car driving around, we were supposed to be interviewing the director, who was not yet cast. And so we were talking to Welles, who was playing the director part off camera. And so Peter and I were these 2 critics, and we were kind of spoofs of ourselves. I was this serious, you know, somewhat pompous young film enthusiast, and he was this sort of slick journalist who wanted to be a filmmaker, you know, kind of parodies of ourselves. And we did a lot of shooting. And then what happened was Peter was just about to go to Texas to make the last picture show. He actually went that following week, or that week. It was a Sunday. We started shooting August 23rd, 1970. And he went to Texas and made the last picture show and became a famous director. And Welles wanted to be in that. He wanted to play Sam the Lion. He said to me, anybody who plays that part will win an Academy Award, which is what happened. Ben Johnson won.
Ben Johnson got the role, even though there were too many words.
Yeah, too many words.
Too many words.
Too many dirty words, Pete.
And then your friend John Ford had to call Ben Johnson and talk him into doing it, and he finally succumbed to the pressure.
Yeah. Ford said, "You want to be Duke's sidekick your whole life? God damn it, do that part." Yeah. But Welles would have ruined the film. Peter was really right, but he admirably withstood Welles's demands or pressures. Peter had a different cast in mind. He told me there was kind of the star cast, and then there was the lesser known cast. He went with the lesser known cast of great people: Cloris Leachman, Ellen Burstyn, Ben Johnson,
Eileen Brennan. You mentioned
Jeff Bridges was just a newcomer at the time. But the star cast would have been people like Jimmy Stewart playing Sam the Lion, Vera Miles would have been one of the older women, and Dorothy Malone would have been another one. Really
Dorothy
good,
Malone.
really good actors. But
Yeah.
he felt that for realism's sake, he wanted people you didn't really know very well. And Ben Johnson had kind of disappeared from the screen for a long time in the 50s, and then he came back in the Wild Bunch, and so we had seen him in the Wild Bunch, but he was very different from what he looked like in the early Ford movies. He had gotten older and heavier and more bitter, and Ford kind of ostracized him. It's a sad story. He had him under contract and they wouldn't let him work because he and Johnson had a falling out, and Johnson went off and joined the rodeo circuit again, became the world rodeo champion. And he was proud of the fact he was the only guy in the world who was world rodeo champion and won an Academy Award.
Wow.
Which is pretty wonderful. So anyway, Peter went off and made this film and became famous. And then Welles rewrote The Other Side of the Wind to give Peter a bigger part, a more serious part, where he plays the young director who's the rival of John Huston and a benefactor of John Huston, and betrays him at one point by not coming to his aid sufficiently. He tries to help the old guy make a film. The old man is trying to finish a film and he's having trouble finishing it, kind of like Welles did in his later years. And but he doesn't. He's plays a guy who has a lot of money, and he at one point Huston is asking him for money, and he won't give him enough money, and so it's kind of a Falstaff Hal betrayal situation, like in Chimes of Midnight, which is a story that Welles did throughout his career. Actually, if you look at all the Welles films, they're mostly about two men who love each other and one betrays the other.
Wow. Yeah, the last scene in Chimes is heartbreaking. Seeing Welles is, Falstaff, right?
Yeah, Keith Baxter is great as he becomes crowned as Henry V and rejects Falstaff.
Yeah, just heartbreaking scene. It really he nailed it, I thought. And but do you feel that what were your feelings, personal feelings about Peter? And did you later on ever get to spend time again with him?
Oh yeah, we spent a fair amount of time over the years here and there, and sometimes a few years ago by we wouldn't see each other, but he was a good friend, and he was supportive of my books, and he was the guy who got me into The Other Side of the Wind, because when I went to Hollywood, I went there to interview John Ford. I waggled interview with him, which was
the same, very similar influences.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of modeled my early career on Peter because he was doing what I wanted to do. He was a journalist who was interviewing these great directors and doing books on people like Ford and Hitchcock and Hawks and Lang, and he also was wanting to be a director, and he had made Targets, which I really admired. I saw that
Roger Corman.
Most people hadn't seen it because it kind of disappeared quickly, but I wanted to do that. I wanted to I was writing books and interviewing filmmakers, but I wanted to write and direct films, and I wound up writing films but not directing. But so I called Peter. I went to Hollywood to interview Ford for the book that Mike Wilmington and I did, and so it was my first time in Hollywood. Ford was the most difficult guy to interview. Actually, the hardest guy to interview for me was Godard. He was even harder to interview. He was extremely unpleasant. I interviewed him in Wisconsin, but Ford was notoriously difficult to interview. But he said some things that were true, and then he also tried to lie and pretend he hadn't remembered certain films and things. But it was the day he retired. He retired in the course of my interview. He announced his retirement.
I remember that.
And I was kind of stunned, and I wondered what was happening, because he kept saying to his secretary, has the gentleman from Italy called yet? Have you heard from the man from Italy? And she kept saying, no, Mr. Ford hasn't called him. And what I found out was happening, and later in his papers, Ford had not been able to make a film in Hollywood for 5 years after his great film Seven Women flopped. And so Woody Strode, his friend and star in some films, had become a star in Italian westerns and was trying to get.
He was known for, right? Sir, he was Once Upon a Time in the West for Sergio Leone.
Yeah, and he made films over in Italy, and
Right.
he wanted to make a film with Ford, and he was trying to set up a film for Ford there, but it didn't happen. And Ford was realizing that day that it was falling through because the phone call he was expecting didn't happen. So I arrived at the last day of Ford's career, which was quite a thing for a young guy
Yeah.
to
That's
show up, 54-year career, and or 56-year career, and he was very bitter, and the last thing he wanted to do was have a young guy ask him questions about Fort Apache and the searchers and stuff.
yeah. When he was so interested in looking forward.
Well, he just was fed up and bitter about his whole career, but he occasionally would come out with some serious comments and
Yeah. Well, I
poignant
mean,
poignant
but
remarks.
I can see these guys, they wanted to be, remain relevant. It's understandable.
Yeah, and Ford had some great projects that he wanted to do, and he couldn't do it, and that happened to a lot of the directors. Billy Wilder and Hawks had some trouble making films. Renoir
Sure.
and
Right.
a lot of the directors I admired. But so that what happened was that when I went to Hollywood, I wanted to meet Peter as well because of our, I admired what
Right.
he was doing. So I went to the Larry Edmunds bookshop, which is a great film bookshop on Hollywood Boulevard, and the guy there, Milton Lubavitsky, I figured he might know Peter, and turned out they were good friends. And he gave me Peter's phone number, and I called him,
Oh.
and he said, "I'm on the other line with Orson. Could you hold on?" And I was stunned because I'd been writing this book on Welles. I was almost finished for 4 years, and Welles was always in Europe, and I would read little items at Variety that he was off in Yugoslavia making a film, but I had no idea he was in America again. And so Peter said, he came back and said, Orson would like you to call him tomorrow at this phone number, and he gave me the number, and I was kind of stunned. And then I went to Peter's house, and he very generously spent 3 hours telling me about Ford and Welles. He knew all the latest information and answered a lot of questions about them. And but Welles had asked him to recruit film buff types for The Other Side of the Wind that he was about to start shooting that Sunday. And actually, that I should say, after I saw Ford that afternoon, I went to see Jean Renoir at his home. So I met
Oh, right.
my three favorite directors in 1 week, plus Peter Bogdanovich.
I thought Hitchcock was that he wasn't in that week?
Well, actually, Hitchcock, I contacted Hitchcock's office. I had done a piece on Topaz that he apparently liked, and he called my hotel and left a note, in the box, but they didn't tell me about it. And he said he would give me an interview, and I missed seeing him because I didn't see the note in time.
Can you
So
imagine?
I could have met him. So this to me,
Right.
I thought every week in Hollywood would be like this, but I didn't realize
Yeah, right.
this was the
Yeah.
pinnacle. And it was kind of all downhill after that, from that wonderful week. But by the end of the week, I was acting in a Welles film because I called Welles, and the first thing he said was, "We're about to start shooting a film. Would you like to be in it?" And
Yeah. No, thank you.
yeah, I was totally stunned because I'd never acted before, unless you count being an altar boy, which is kind of like a theatrical thing.
Take your word for it.
Yeah, well, except I say it's like a Robert Bresson movie because you have your back to the camera and you have no expression, and you speak Latin, and you speak in a monotone, and you can't show emotions, and it's very alienated acting, but it is a form of theater. But anyway, so he said, come on over to the house. And so that Friday, I guess I went to his house and talked to him for about 3 hours. And then he said, we're going to have dinner. And I sat around and had dinner with him and a bunch of people. And I met Gary Graver that day, his cameraman. And I got a chance to talk to Welles and ask him all the questions I could think of about projects he was doing. And he told me the story of the film about this old director trying to make a comeback in the new Hollywood of what we now call the Easy Rider period. And he wanted to cast a lot of people he called personages playing themselves, versions of themselves, kind of takeoffs on themselves or other people. And so he wanted me and some other people to be true to life, crazed film buff types, and
Right.
he thought we were very funny. Peter and I were very funny, and some other people too. And then, so that Sunday we were there, and we spent 12 hours shooting. We did 27 scenes, which is amazing, 27 setups.
It's amazing.
I found out one of the myths about Welles is that he was a lazy, slow director or whatever. But Charlton Heston said he was the most efficient director he ever worked with, which I think is quite a tribute.
Touch of
And
evil.
I found that, yeah, Touch of Evil. Welles would shoot 18-hour days, and he, you know, we'd all be worn out, but he'd be going strong. And, you know, we did a tremendous amount of shooting each time, but it stretched out over 5 years because he had trouble, you know, he had to raise money. It was his own money to make the film. And at a certain point, it's a long, complicated story, but to make it short, he needed more money, and he made a deal with the Shah of Iran's brother-in-law, who was involved in film production, to give him more money, and that caused a lot of problems financially and politically. And when the Shah took over, they tried to seize the negative of the other side of the wind. It got tied up in litigation for a long time, and it took forever to get it out. And I tried with Gary Graver in later years to get it out. We actually made a deal with Showtime, or a tentative deal, because we showed it to almost everybody in Hollywood. Everybody turned it down because it was so avant-garde and unusual. And they had
you
trouble.
had that portion that you had a portion, right?
Yeah, Welles, before he died in 1985, edited 41 minutes, which we showed people. But Gary, I think in retrospect, unfortunately, tried to make it look like a rough cut by adding another 54 minutes to it. And he tried to make it look like a finished story, but it was sort of a mess, the parts that he added to it.
I see. Didn't help
the Welles parts were beautifully cut, but the other parts he shouldn't have added on. And I said to him at one point, why don't we go in the editing room and cut it down to about 60 minutes of just Welles's material and 2 or 3 good scenes? And he didn't want to do that, but people would look at it. Even, you know, civilians, as we call them in the industry, non-film people, can't watch a rough cut. They have no idea how to judge it. But even people in the industry would see this, and they would look at it. Like George Lucas said, I don't understand this film, and Spielberg turned it down, and Clint Eastwood turned it down, and
amazing.
Oliver Stone turned it down. Everybody turned down. And so I finally said, why don't we go to a cable company? This was a new thing at the time, cable TV showing films. And Showtime was one of the first, you know, subscription channels. And there was an executive there, Matthew Duda, who wanted to make the film, who really tried. But at that point, Peter and Oya Kodar, who's Welles's partner, and she inherited his share of the film, and the Iranian guy had the other part. Oya and Peter fired me at that point when we made the deal with Showtime, or the tentative deal. And they felt they didn't need me anymore. And that was very short-sighted, because, you know, if I had been allowed to stay with the film, it probably would have come out around 2004, I'm guessing. But I just bowed out because I didn't want to cause any trouble for this film. It had enough trouble, even though I thought it was unfair. But in retrospect, I'm glad I got fired, because Philip Jan Rimsa, a young Polish producer, was the guy who really galvanized.
He's been on here.
Oh, has he?
Yeah, I brought him on. Yeah, he did the podcast.
Great. Well, he and Frank Marshall, who's a powerhouse in Hollywood, who worked on The Other Side of the Wind as a young man, and Peter Bogdanovich were the 3 producers who finished the film. And Philip did the yeoman's work of negotiating with Oya for 9 years to get her to agree to take $1,335,000 for her share. And I had offered her $1 million back in 1999. And $1 million in 2018 would be about 1.3 million. So, I mean, she didn't gain any money by stalling for 9 years, but I couldn't imagine wasting 9 years of my life negotiating with her. She was driving poor Philip crazy. He was very diplomatic, but he got it done. And then Bob Murawski came in and edited the film, and then, you know, I was helping advise on the completion. And it's a triumphant release. I give Netflix a lot of credit. They put up $6 million to finish it. They originally put up $5 million, which was paying off the owners, but also the post-production was very complicated. But at one point, Frank Marshall had to call them and say, you know, we just found out we lost, a lot of the sound was lost, the original sound recordings. Fortunately, they had copies, dupes of a lot of material, and they could take the sound off those, but they had to get an Academy Award-winning sound guy to improve the sound, and then we re-recorded a lot of dialogue.
Yeah, well, you can see in Peter Jackson's Beatles documentary, you know, the Let It Be. Did you get a chance to watch that?
I haven't seen that yet. No, it sounds interesting.
You'll see they kind of copied that technique, because they had lots of footage where the original audio was missing, obviously, and so they've transplanted audio, and it worked beautifully. I mean, and it looks spectacular, and I mean, it's just incredible.
Well, in the other side of the wind,
Document.
you can't tell that the sound was massaged and improved, but it's we didn't change the dialogue. I re-recorded 17 lines of my dialogue, and they called me in at one point. I watched the semi-final cut, and they said, "Oh, by the way, would you come in this other room and re-record some of your dialogue?" And I said, "Oh, okay." Very casual. And I told the sound recorder, I said, "Geez, don't I sound different? It's been 48 years, and I'm older and I smoked for a long time." And he said, "No, you sound about the same." And he said, "If you don't sound right, we'll play around with the audio."
Right. They can speed it up, maybe tweak it a little so your voice is a little higher.
Yeah, and nobody could tell the difference. So I did 17 lines. There's a funny story about the last line I did. I went back home to Berkeley, and then a few months later, Bob Murawski wanted me to re-record one line. I get on a bus at one point, and I say a couple lines. Paul Stewart is in there, who played the butler in Citizen Kane, and Edmund O'Brien, and a couple Mercedes McCambridge. And I could walk and I could talk, but I couldn't walk and talk at the same time. I was such a limited actor. So when we did the scene in 1971, I was having trouble doing it because I had to get on the bus, say something, turn, say something else, and then walk down the aisle. And Welles was despairing of trying to get me to do it. So he turned to Paul Stewart, who was an experienced TV and radio director. And he said, "Paul, could you tell him how to do it?" And Paul said, "Okay, you do this, you say this, you go boom, you stop, you wait a beat, and you turn left, you turn right, you boom, boom, boom." And I did the scene in one take with Paul's expert direction.
Mm-hmm.
And Welles thought it was very funny, and he called me One Take Pister. My name was Pister in the film. And but anyway, we re-recorded this, and Bob brought me into a studio in Berkeley, and he was in LA, and he wanted me to do the line again, but with a little different emphasis on one syllable. And I said, "How come? We did it the other way." And he said, "Well, trust me, it's the way I'm editing this thing together. It'll work fine." And I said, "Okay." So I did 17 takes of this. Finally, we got it, the right rhythm. And then he said, "Congratulations, this is a historic moment. This is the last sound recording on this film." And I said, "Well, Bob, this one line took 3 directors, Orson Welles, Paul Stewart, and Bob Murawski, to get this one line right." And he said, "Well, that tells you something about the performance, doesn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, thank you very much." And he said, "I'm just kidding." But that was a magic of movies. It was a very surreal experience to re-record my lines, and I was able to improve my performance. I didn't change the dialogue, but we did a few wild lines. Bob said we needed a line here of just a couple words just to make something make sense, so we threw in a few things, but we kept Welles's dialogue the same.
Well, for anybody who still hasn't seen it, it's I think a really entertaining, trippy film. This must still be available on Netflix.
Yeah, I asked a Netflix executive, "How long will it be there?" And he said, "Oh, forever."
Yeah, it's their movie.
As long as it's a Netflix. But I was going to say, by the way, that when Frank found out that they didn't have the sound, he called Netflix and said, "We got to spend another $1 million to redo the sound." And they said, "Sure." And they sent him a check for $1 million without question. I give them a lot of credit. They trusted Frank, who's a very experienced producer.
Oh yeah,
Spielberg films and everything, and Philip and Peter. And
I tried to get Frank on. I requested him. I got Peter finally got Peter on.
Oh.
Yeah, with his last film project, actually. But it was right as he was right at the release. It was all like, he came into this New York City with, he had all these projects, and is like the last sort of, I don't know. It was his kind of the last swell of work, and he had so much going on, and it was the Buster Keaton documentary.
Oh, okay. He also had that film, She's Funny That Way. You talked about that probably.
No.
Oh, that was his last feature he directed. But an interesting thing, somebody found Peter's cut. I don't know if you read about that, but somebody on eBay was selling a videotape of Peter Bogdanovich's original cut of She's Funny That Way. It was originally called Squirrels to the Nuts. And then the company that made the film made him do a lot of reshooting and re-editing and sort of messed up the film, according to Peter. But Peter, in his final days, according to Peter Tunget, who is his biographer, told me Peter Bogdanovich was working on trying to get out his director's cut of Squirrels to the Nuts. And there is some hope that that will come out, because his ex-wife Louise, he was living with her, he was very close to her, a really terrific person. Louise Stratton, Dorothy Stratton's sister, very nice person. She is his collaborator on a lot of late films, and she's going to try to get his cut out of it. Which should be terrific, you know.
That would be wonderful.
I'm glad you got Peter on.
Me too. It was a highlight, you know, other than, of course, your visits.
Thank you. Well, I hope you get Frank. He's a wonderful guy, and
I would love to get him.
He's a great storyteller.
I have his email, but
he's a busy man, and he's producing films, big films. But he started with Peter on Targets.
I know, it's amazing.
Yeah. And he was a production manager on Other Side of the Wind. That's when I met him in 1971. He was a young guy, and he was production manager on the film.
Yeah, I think I have to close the circle with getting Frank ultimately on. Maybe. Yeah. You know, maybe this will help if I send him this link. Maybe this.
Yeah, I'll tell him Joe recommends you be on the show.
Whatever.
Frank,
sure.
You know. Peter recommends it. Joe recommends it.
As I just want to ask you, because I'm sure, as prolific as you are, that you have your next subject in mind, and you know, seeming that directors are obviously so important to you, you know, and I was wondering if maybe you had your next subject in mind already.
No, I don't actually. I think, you know, I worked so hard on these 4 books, and I'm taking kind of a hiatus for a while and just rethinking what I want to do in the future. And, you know, I feel I had certain pet projects I wanted to do for a long time. Into the Nightmare, Political Truth. I did a book called The Broken Places, which is a memoir dealing with my troubled youth and my first girlfriend, who was a tragic figure who really saved my life. And I spent 49 years on that book. And one of the things I did was I got a job in 2002 teaching at San Francisco State. And before that, I was a struggling, you know, freelance writer, which is, you know, a difficult job, because I can't afford to write biographies anymore, because they just ruin you financially every time you do one, because you get an advance, but it's never enough to really do it right.
I see.
So after I did the Ford biography, I thought, well, I'll never do another biography. And I wrote a book called Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. That's another pet project.
Yeah, you were on for that. And that was really brought up maybe the most dramatic of those experiences that you had, in terms of your trying to unmask Frank Capra, the truth about maybe that was being suppressed by you know, right, Robert Gottlieb and Janine Basinger, I believe, and Basinger. Yeah.
She's his archivist, Capra's archivist at Wesleyan
University. Yeah, I remember that was quite a book, and it was also just a great book on, you know, being a biographer, but just such a stressful period of time for you, and it just. Ultimately, I know that that's a great read. People should pick that up. It's called, Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. Yeah. And I have it in mind to read his book, and then read your Capra book after that. It's all in the plans. I just have to catch up with, you know, I try to keep up, you know. Well, I'm glad you're taking a little break, because maybe I can knock off a couple more of your.
Yeah, you have a little time. I'm giving you a little time. Well, I've done basically two volumes of Capra biography, if you look at it that way.
Yeah.
Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, came out in 1992 after a 7.5-year struggle. I mean, to write the book, and 4 of those years were spent on the legal battle to get it out, because Janine Basinger and Robert Gottlieb, who was my editor at Knopf, were trying to suppress the book or to alter the book, to neuter the book, because I discovered many things that Capra's autobiography, the name of the title, is basically a 700-page lie, right? And almost nothing in it checks out. So it was a epic research adventure, and I found out all kinds of things that people didn't know. But the main revelation was that he was an informer during the blacklist period. It turned in,
which is really, and why? And then that Janine and Gottlieb, if they were helping to suppress that information. I mean, Capra was still alive during this period, so that was obviously their motivation. But just really kind of, now we see it all over the place, politically, and their entire cable networks devoted to suppressing the truth and spreading propaganda and but back, it's just kind of in that, considering where they, academics and literature publishing, these are supposed to be where
well, you're supposed to have freedom of the press in America, and it's a struggle against company. Knopf is supposed to be one of the great publishers. Random House is
Simon Schuster, right? Ultimately published that.
Yeah, after I realized Knopf was not going to publish the book in the form I wanted. They were either trying to just make me drop the book, or they're going to edit it their way and gut the book and take out the revelations about his politics. And he was a Republican, conservative, right-wing person, and he was a bigot, and he masqueraded as a kind of humanistic liberal, and so his whole life was kind of a lie. But he was still a great filmmaker. I still like his films, and I've actually liked his films even more because I understand them better, where he's coming from. But I corrected the record, and they didn't want the record corrected because it shattered all the myths of Capra. But I finally got the book out, but it took about a year once they agreed to let me take it away. That took a long time to get to that point, and I had to be very methodical about it. So this book is a very Kafkaesque. It's like The Trial. It's a black comic, horrifying tale of being trapped with this.
It is.
Corrupt archivist and corrupt publisher, and then
when you were a young man trying to support a family, and you're just becoming a dad, and and it was like, and you're being constantly gaslighted, which is
exactly. And my wife, Ruth O'Hara, who's a psychologist, she's now a dean at Stanford, very distinguished psychologist, was extremely supportive and a brilliant legal mind and tactician, and she was without her, I couldn't have gotten this victory, and I won the legal victory. And basically, I got the right to take the book away to another publisher, and I took it to Simon and Schuster, and they proved to be honest. And Bob Bender was my editor, very honest and very good editor. And
is he around still?
He's still working. Yeah, he's still.
These people, I mean, one thing you have to say is they last. Both Janine and Robert Gottlieb were still alive, I believe.
Yeah, Gottlieb just published a book on Greta Garbo, and Janine Basinger is still publishing books with Knopf, and Robert Gottlieb is their editor. They just keep. Part of her motive was also to insinuate herself and become a Knopf author at my expense.
Right. And she had her own project right on Capra.
She
didn't tell you, but she was just suppressing, again, lying about it.
Yeah, at the time, I found out through Gottlieb that she was doing a book on It's a Wonderful Life, which is sort of a sentimental bunch of mythical hogwash about It's a Wonderful Life, and it misses a lot of the story that I turned up about the actual making of the film. And it denies, for example, that Michael Wilson, who's a blacklisted writer, Capra informed on him later, and he did one of the final polishes of the film, and it doesn't mention that key fact, for example. And Michael Wilson's widow, Zelma, told me that he would come home groaning about writing dialogue for an angel because he was an ex-Catholic, but she said he was a professional writer and he did his job, and he wasn't a big fan of Capra. And he wrote a draft of The Friendly Persuasion, the Jessamine West book about Quakers in the Civil War and pacifism. It's a pacifist script that he wrote, and Capra dropped it because, for two reasons. One was the Korean War was on, and he thought a pacifist film would not be a good idea. And also he found out that Wilson was accused of being a communist, and he was testified before HUAC, and he was blacklisted, and Capra informed on him and Sidney Buckman and Hugo Butler and several other people. So it's a tragic story because Capra's first 45 years were very successful, but success really helped ruin him because he wasn't able to handle it well, and it put him in a difficult position. He became an important figure, and he was asked for his opinion about politics, and he was chosen by the US Army to make propaganda films in World War II, and he was not trained. engineering education, basically. He wasn't very sophisticated about history and politics, and so he couldn't handle it. And he also kind of panicked. It's the imposter syndrome, as they call it in psychology, that you feel you're not worthy of the success. And he also had doubts about whether being a director was really as important as people made it seem, because he thought writers were more important than directors. But
well,
rather than honor them and respect them, like some directors did, like Howard Hawks, for example, George Cukor, Capra resented his writers and belittled them and alienated people like Robert Riskin, who was a liberal. Capra was a Republican. So what people missed about Capra was that his films were a collaboration between a right-wing director and liberal or leftist screenwriters. And Capra was big enough in his prime that he would listen to people of different political views and take good ideas from them and synthesize them into a film that he would feel comfortable directing. But for example, Buckman was a member of the Communist Party when he wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is a great film, and it made Capra uncomfortable that he was a communist, but he still went along with it. And Buckman wrote a great script, and it's a very patriotic film, but it criticizes the corruption of our system, but it's ultimately defends democracy against fascism. And but Capra informed on Buckman later, when it became uncomfortable, and he kind of said, the writers made me do it. So it's a tragic story. And then the last part of his life was the big downhill slide. And that's one reason I wrote the book. I wanted to know why Capra, his career collapsed after It's a Wonderful Life, and he didn't make any good films after that. And it's a very sad story. And I found out by going to Wesley and looking through his papers that, the key was when he started informing and betraying his own principles, the principles of the Bill of Rights that he espouses in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, for example, and in the Why We Fight films. And so he was eaten up with guilt and shame. And it's a great American
funny. I saw him on I was watching, I was going down one of those YouTube rabbit holes after Peter died. And there was one Cavett show with Peter, Mel Brooks, Robert Altman, and Capra. And I gotta say, they brought a Capra. He's so uncomfortable in this. I don't know if you've ever seen that episode.
Yeah, I have. And Peter and Capra. Peter is very smooth and suave.
And Mel Brooks is, of course, the ham and always happy to, suck the air out of the room and just make it all about. But he's very entertaining. And that's, that makes for good television.
And Robert Altman is
Capra seemed to be devoid of humor and also just so uncomfortable, could barely get a sentence out. Just seemed to be so in his own way, it's like, psychologically, that he couldn't express himself very well.
Well, he was living a lie, and that's part of the sadness and the tragedy of the book. I found out, for example, I found a letter he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, he expressed contempt for his fans. He said, these people think I'm this great liberal, and, they think I'm this wonderful guy, and they have no idea what I'm really like. And he was just heaping contempt on his fans.
It's his own fault for not, it's not like nobody was interested, it's just be a conservative,
Well, he's a good contrast to Kazan, because Kazan was, a communist who betrayed his colleagues and informed on them.
Oh yeah.
And he did the opposite thing. He didn't hide it. He went public with it, and he took the heat. And it's an interesting moral question: who is a worse person, the person who admits the crime and takes the heat, or the person who covers it up out of shame? You could say that,
no doubt it's Kazan in my eyes.
I would say maybe
and then he writes a biography and doubles down. I mean, it's
it's a powerful biography, though, because nobody could do it.
Well, he's an incredible writer, and he was a one of the great filmmakers of he was probably single-handedly responsible for bringing film into the kind of a more modern, contemporary, vernacular.
Wells was asked about him at the Cinematheque Française in 1982. Some young woman got up and said, "What do you think of Elia Kazan?" And he said, "Cher mademoiselle, you have brought up the wrong metteur en scène." And he said, Kazan is by many measures one of our most important filmmakers, a great director, but he is a traitor, and he betrayed all of his colleagues to Joe McCarthy. That's sort of a mistake. It wasn't to Joe McCarthy, it was to HUAC, and he didn't betray all his colleagues, but it was about 8 people.
Who said this?
Wells said this too.
Well, he and McCarthy were, as yourself were all from Wisconsin, so maybe there was that connection.
Yeah, Wells was thinking of running against McCarthy in 46, and it would have been interesting. He regretted not doing that.
Oh,
he wanted to be a senator.
But then
anyway, my point is Wells was blacklisted. He
was in Europe, though.
Yeah, he went to Europe in the fall of 47. Most of the books said it was 48, but I found out it was by early November 47, which was right after the HUAC hearings. He fled to Europe. He would have been probably called to testify, and he would not have informed.
Absolutely. Right.
He was a progressive, what they call premature anti-fascist. So he was basically blacklisted, but the blacklist was not absolute. Like, for example, 20th Century Fox, Daryl Zanuck was a friend of his, cast him in some foreign productions, but he didn't come back to America until he made Touch of Evil, except in 53 he came back to do King Lear on CBS with Peter Brook directing, and he did a bunch of CBS programs. He did I Love Lucy, and he did The Fountain of Youth for Desi Lu. And what you had to do in those days to be working was to write a letter to the network saying, I'm sorry for my political affiliations. You didn't have to inform on people. And no letter has turned up that he wrote like that, but he must have done that to CBS to get to work for, Peter Brook and Desi Lu. And Lucille Ball had been an actual communist.
Right. It's actually the segment that I think that is the catalyst for the opening of this new movie, right?
Well, she did a brilliant thing. She went before HUAC, and she basically played the scatterbrained Lucy character in front of HUAC and said, oh, geez, I don't know, my grandfather got me into signing this petition. She got away with it partly because she was very ballsy about it, but also she was such a big moneymaker for CBS.
Right.
But my point is, she and Desi Arnaz were sympathetic to Wells and helped him get some work in Hollywood. And then he did Touch of Evil, and that was a traumatic event for him when they took that away from him. So he went back to Europe until 1970. So he was in exile for a long time because of the blacklist period. So a lot of lives were disrupted and careers, but
sure.
he made a life for himself in Europe as an independent filmmaker of doing avant-garde films and films like The Trial, and he made documentaries. He made Mr. Arkadin. So he made some very interesting films in Europe. He made Othello, which you probably couldn't have done in Hollywood.
Right.
But Capra was just destroyed by the blacklist, and it shows in a way that he was, he had a moral sense, but he knew that he had violated his own morality, but he kept it a secret. But what he did was he gave his papers to Wesleyan. It was a form of confession, I think. I don't know if it was conscious or subconscious, but when you give all your papers for scholars like me to come along and study with the revelations, it's like confession.
Right.
And I interviewed Capra for about a year and got him to talk about all kinds of things that he was uncomfortable talking about. I confronted him with a lot of things. I didn't get to confront him with the full force of all the political things because I was saving that for, I was building up to it, and then he had a series of strokes and I wasn't allowed to see him anymore. But I had a whole year of interviews with him. But I interviewed, I think it was 175 other people. And I got the whole story. And the moment when I knew I was in big trouble with Gottlieb, he said to me fairly early on, he said, you know it all, you may know too much. And he said, the slasher will go to work. And I thought, wow, my editor is saying, you know it all, you may know too much. Isn't a biographer supposed to know it all? And why is that?
Right.
Why is that too much? And also, how does he know that I know it all? I mean, I did know it all. I had the story, I knew it was a big story. I'm an old newspaper guy, and I knew I had a big story, but it took 3 or 4 years to get all the facts, and I got documents from the government, and I didn't get his FBI files until the book came out. It took 7 years of, my lawyer was working on getting the files from the government. They came soon after the book came out. So I did a new version in 2002 where I had a long appendix with more than 500 pages of new information from the government that it didn't changed the fundamental story, but it added a lot of detail. So then the book, Frankly, Unmasking Capra, tells the whole story of how I uncovered all this and all the roadblocks that I had. It's very instructive about what can happen in the publishing world. It's a real nightmare. And the way I frame it is telling the truth about a major American figure who is a fraud is a very difficult thing to do because of all the forces arrayed against the writer who's trying to do that.
Right.
It's not easy in America to expose somebody
It's
who's
a Capra story.
Cultural hero. Yeah, and his films deal with fraudulent people often, like Mr. Mi Chan Do is a guy who's sort of a likable average guy who gets sucked into being a spokesman for a fascist domestic organization, and he realizes he's a fraud. He's been set up by Barbara Stanwyck, and he confesses his fraudulence. And there's a great quote from Capra about that film. He said, when the public realizes you're a fraud and you've let them down, they really turn on you, and they really take out after you. They feel very bad when you betray them. And that's kind of what happened with Capra. Capra knew that he had betrayed the public and betrayed his fans, but he had contempt for his fans, and he had a lot of contempt for himself, a lot of self-hatred.
Right.
So it's a really tragic,
man. Yeah.
Tragic story. I felt, despite the fact that I disapproved of his behavior, I felt sorry for him, and I kind of liked him in some strange ways too. I mean, it's
I understand. People are complicated. You know,
my favorite comment on the book, John Sanford, who is a blacklisted writer who worked with Capra, a very good historian. He was a communist his whole life. He never left the party, and he was blacklisted, and his wife was blacklisted. And he said he read the book. He gave me interviews and he gave me documents and things. And then he said, I hated Capra, but when I read your book, I felt pity for him in the Aristotelian sense that Aristotle said what you feel for a tragic hero is pity. And a tragic figure is somebody who recognizes his flaws, and he destroys himself, but he recognizes his flaws. But John Sanford said, for the first time, I felt pity for this man who I hated. So that I thought he said that was a great tribute to your work, because you humanize this guy who I hated. You know, well, so I felt that's what I was trying to do.
I'm sorry, Joe. I'm just going to say I'm looking forward to it. I just had read Sterling Hayden's memoir, and there's another example of what you're talking about. Somebody who, you know, he was a lot more, he was a lot less forgiving of himself, or, you know, he was very complicated, but, you know, and maybe suffered from mental illness. And
well, a lot of people respect him, even though he was an informer, because he felt such guilt and shame.
And he was the first to sort of, you know, criticize his decision.
He accused himself, and that takes a lot of guts. Whereas Kazan is an interesting figure because he, you know, I feel nobody could do a number on Kazan like Kazan. When you read his book, it is very excoriating, self-excoriating, and yet he's defending himself, which is interesting to read as self-defense, but it's a disturbing book. But I haven't looked at Kazan's papers, so I don't know how, you know, most autobiographies are lies to some extent, so I'm not willing to say that Kazan's book is completely truthful, but it seems truthful. But Capra's book seemed truthful at the time, because he criticized himself a lot, and that misled people. When you think if somebody criticizes himself, the book must be honest. But you know who has Kazan's papers? Janine Basinger at Wesleyan has Kazan's papers, so I couldn't go and look at them if I wanted to, you know.
Exactly.
But she was a buddy. She was a buddy of Kazan, which tells you something.
No doubt. There, oh, listen, I have to make dinner. I gotta have dinner.
It's a good time to have dinner. I was just thinking about how she and Kazan would go out for pizza and Greek food together.
Oh, you know? Oh, right, of course.
Yeah.
Kazan was Greek adjacent.
He was.
What was the last name?
Kazanjiglu was his original name. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they fled the Armenian massacre, and
I mean, anybody who's interested in Hollywood biographies, after you read Searching for John Ford and, you know, Frankly, and Yeah, and the Billy Wilder book. You should read I should read the Ilya Kazan.
Yeah, it's quite a remarkable book.
It really is remarkable.
Yeah, and there's also a good book called Kazan and Kazan by Michel Simon. It's an interview book, and Kazan also admitted that being an informer was a shameful thing to do. He was disarmingly candid about how it was shameful, but he also defended his supposed right to do that. So he was a complicated man, but a great director of actors as well.
Another good one to read, by the way.
Thank you. Really good. Really great director of actors, Kazan. Capra was a great director of actors too.
Oh, absolutely. And he cast some of the best. But I'm going to go I have to go cast my dinner.
Yeah, cast your dinner and have
it's 8:30.
Yeah, have a good dinner. It's really great talking to you, Adam.
I know. Well, we can continue on. We don't need that much of an excuse, although it's always good to get the word out about your latest books.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for talking about all of them. I really appreciate that. And it's been a busy, productive period. I've been really stimulated by writing all these books. So I hope people read them and
Right. And you're professor at San Francisco State.
Yeah, I teach screenwriting every year, or basic screenwriting, and I'm doing a course on Orson Welles. Actually, tonight I'm going to do a Welles class, and I'm teaching a course on Fahrenheit 451, the Truffaut film.
Sure.
Where I'm dealing with censorship and burning books, which is I use a quote from
coming back into fashion, Joe.
Huh?
Coming back into fashion.
Yeah, it's burning books. Now, let me just find a quote from Ray Bradbury that. Where do I have this? Well, anyway, he said, I use this as an epigraph for frankly, that there are a lot of people running around with lit matches, trying to set fires, and you got to watch out for these people, basically. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people trying to burn. Actually, some guy in Texas wants to burn books.
Right. No, and they're trying to erase facts and history.
Yeah,
as we speak,
it's a very timely subject for students. I'm talking about censorship and cancel culture and all the ramifications. We live in a kind of new blacklist period, And,
yeah, totally, and also, anti-democratic, anti-democracy. Excuse me. But we have so much more we could talk about.
Yeah, political truth. I deal with the threat to democracy from lies and dishonest reporting leads to. January 6th, the lies that Trump told, and how we live in a country. I'll just wrap it up by saying we live in a divided country, as everybody says, of two different belief systems. Half the country believes one set of facts, half believe another set of things. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, "You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts."
Right.
So I write about that in this book, that the Kennedy assassination started that process, which most people attribute to the war in Vietnam, but it started before that, and then it led to our current impasse that we have. So anyway, good talking to you about all these things, Adam. It all ties together in different ways.
I agree.
Trying to tell the truth. Billy Wilder was trying to do exposés, and the Coen Brothers in their own
I feel
way.
like, and I feel we gotta, we need to do at some point a part 2 about just Billy Wilder. But
yeah, I'll talk about any Billy Wilder film. It'd be fun to talk about.
Maybe just pick one film or something.
That'd be fun.
What's your just close with? Actually, there's another now PPS here. Just close with. I would like to know your favorite Billy Wilder film, if you can.
I think the one I like the best. I think his best film is probably Some Like It Hot. It's a really great film. Perfect script, perfect direction. The one I love probably the most is Avanti. It's a film that not a lot of people like.
Yeah, I like that one.
It's charming.
Of his latter films, of his last chapter.
I try really, to advocate for his later films being really wonderful. And Avanti is his most successful romantic comedy in the Lubitchian tradition. He tried several times to make Lubitchian films without total success, but that one is just a charming, lovely, poignant, moving, funny.
Right. With Jack Lemmon and Juliette Mills.
Just great. So I recommend that one. And then, of course, Some Like It Hot. I just did the audio commentaries for Some Like It Hot, and The Apartment is coming out soon.
Wait, on what?
Kino Lorber is doing.
They're going to do The Apartment?
Yeah, I've done it already, and Some Like It Hot 4K and Blu-ray.
Great, I'm excited.
Editions. Yeah, those two films.
I've been showing my son. We just watched The Godfather. I'm trying to start to introduce him. I want him to see Some Like It Hot in The Apartment. think he's ready for that.
Those are great films for young people to
Yeah,
really see
totally.
what classic films
absolutely.
are like. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I think he'll really like it, both of those films.
Yeah, Some Like It Odd was.
And then I want him to see, I want him to see Dr. Strangelove. But I got a lot. There's a long list.
That's another one that changed my life. Some Like It Odd and Dr. Strangelove are among the films that changed me into a different person.
Wow. Well, that's
Anyway.
a topic that maybe that's the topic. What changed it? Films that have changed who you are, the very fun, shaking your foundation.
They're about four.
Made you rethink about your identity. I love that idea.
Yeah, there were 3 or 4 of them we could talk about. That'd be a good topic. Yeah.
That would be. All right,
Okay.
good. Maybe
Great talking to you, Adam.
Same here, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you later. Thanks so much. See you
Thank
later.
you.
Bye.
All right, man. Bye-bye.